You strike a match and don't even think about it. A stove clicks on, a lighter sparks, a candle burns. Fire feels tame, domestic, yours. But what if that comfort is the biggest illusion in human history? What if fire was never ours at all, just something we borrowed, like a dangerous pet that could always turn on us? And the strangest part, the first humans who kept it alive didn't even know how to make it. Tonight, we're going to travel from the first wild flames that terrified our ancestors, to the stolen embers they carried across continents, to the moment we thought we had mastered it only to find out it still controls us. So before we begin, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe pull a blanket close. And remember, every flame you've ever seen has a story. Let's start with the first one. Before hands could hold it, fire ruled the earth. It was not a thing to be owned, or tamed, or coaxed into life with patience. It was a force older than language, older than bone tools, older than any plan our species would one day make. Fire did not wait for permission. It appeared where it pleased, lingered as long as it wanted, and vanished without a trace. Long before your ancestors knew the taste of cooked meat, flames walked the earth on their own legs made of wind, heat, and hunger. They came in the form of jagged skylight, slicing the clouds and kissing the driest grass. In the form of molten rivers spilling from mountains that seemed to breathe smoke. In the way a single tree struck just so could turn into a tower of orange, its crown tossing sparks into the night like angry stars. You would not have approached it then, not if you valued your skin. The smell, alone thick and oily, spoke of danger. Animals knew this too. Herds would scatter long before the heat touched them. Even the predators, the kind who feared nothing else, would keep their distance. And yet if you were watching from a safe ridge, you might have noticed something strange. The places where fire had passed were not dead forever. Days or weeks later, green shoots would appear in the blackened soil, brighter than the ones nearby. New life seemed to grow best in the places fire had claimed. Fire was both destroyer and gardener, but it was not your gardener. It tended no one's field. Some of the oldest landscapes bear scars of these ancient burnings, charcoal layers in the earth, deep enough that no living memory could explain them. Entire hillsides that once were forest, transformed in a single night to open plains where new animals grazed. For millions of years, this was the natural order fire came and went on its own terms. Think about that. There was a time when no living creature could make fire. The only fire was wildfire. No spark struck by hand, no steady campfire glow, no ember cradled in bark. And if you were one of the early hominin soup-right, clever enough to nap stone, but still vulnerable, you might have known fire only as a sign to move, a red warning on the horizon. We like to imagine ourselves as born masters of our tools, but the truth is humbling. For hundreds of thousands of years, our kind lived under the reign of fire the way we live under weather. It was an event, not a possession, like a storm. It came with little warning and left when it chose. If you close your eyes, you can picture it in African savanna 3 million years ago. The air tastes dry, like stone. Heat presses against your back, but the sun is already low, bleeding its last colour into the clouds. Thinner crack, not like thunder but sharper. A tree not far away explodes into light. The sound is violent enough to freeze you, but the sight pulls at your chest. It's dangerous, but it's beautiful. You're not alone in feeling that pull. Even the animals, after their initial panic, will sometimes linger at the edge of a burn. Scavengers know that fire makes food available. Carcasses of the unlucky, seeds split open, insects fleeing the heat. In that way, fire was a kind of silent hunter, killing without teeth, feeding without hands. And this is where the story begins for us. We did not invent fire, we watched it. We learned its moods. We learned the signs that a storm might bring it. We learned to follow the blackened trail it left behind, because in the ashes, there was opportunity. Archaeologists today find layers of soil darkened with charcoal and ash that predate any evidence of human-made flame. They find stone tools buried above and below these burn layers, proof that our ancestors walked in a world already shaped by fire, already using its after effects long before they dared to touch it. The thought is unsettling. Isn't it that our most important discovery was not a creation, but an encounter? For a very long time, The closest we came to owning fire was proximity. We could walk near it, close enough to feel its warmth, but far enough to avoid its bite. We could watch how it shifted with the wind, how it died when rain fell, how it seemed to hide in certain woods and grasses. We could eat what it left behind, and perhaps sit in its lingering heat once the flames had gone. But we could not yet hold it. And here's something worth remembering in those early days. Fire didn't just shape the land, it shaped our behaviour. Where fire passed, predators might be scarce for a while. Where lightning struck often, the landscape would open, making hunting easier. Even without controlling it, we were already living in the rhythm of its visits. Think of fire as a visiting god. It arrived without summons, left without goodbye, and punished anyone who tried to embrace it. And yet, its visits were gifts. We can never know the first moment one of our ancestors decided not to run, but to linger just at the edge. Perhaps they were hungry. Perhaps the night was too cold. Perhaps they had learned that sometimes, after the flames, the world was better. From that decision, a seed was planted, and not in the ground, but in the mind. A recognition this thing that terrifies us could also save us. It would take hundreds of thousands of years to turn that recognition into action. But here, in the time before hands could hold it, the pattern began. Watch the sky, smell the air, follow the smoke, because somewhere out there, fire was walking the earth again. And if you found it, and if you stayed alive, you could borrow it. For a night, for a week, until the next rain. But never forever. Imagine warmth so close you can feel it and die if you touch it. You're standing at the edge of a clearing. The sun has already gone, but the sky is still bruised with its afterglow. In front of you, fire moves like an animal, breathing, reaching, crouching low, then leaping high. Every part of your body tells you to stay back. The heat pushes against your face. The air itself feels heavy, as if it's carrying invisible teeth. This is not the safe or domestic fire you know. This is wildfire, uninvited, untethered, and always a few steps from becoming something worse. For early hominins, this was the only kind of fire there was. It had no predictable schedule. It did not care if you were cold. If you were lucky, lightning would strike a tree or dry grass somewhere nearby. If you were unlucky, it would happen too close, too suddenly, leaving no time to escape. And yet that glow was hard to ignore. Imagine your ribs aching from shivering after weeks of rain. Your hands are stiff, your breath turning to mist even before night falls. Then one day, you see that glow ahead. Not the soft grey of moonlight, but something sharpered and gold and alive. You take a step closer. The ground is warm under your feet. The shadows twitch on the trees as if they're alive. Your heart is pounding in your ears. The warmth you've been craving for so long is right there. You could stretch your hands forward and feel it. But you've seen what happens to those who step too close for or skin turning black. Bodies collapsing in the grass. The line between life-saving heat and life-ending heat is impossibly thin. For a long time, the rule was simple. Stay just close enough to feel it. No closer. Animals seem to understand this instinctively. Hyenas would circle the edge of a burn site, keeping the heat at their flanks, never at their face. Birds would swoop low over the flames to catch the insects fleeing from the grass, but never linger. Even the boldest creatures treated fire like a dangerous neighbourful to know, deadly to invite inside. Human if we can even call our ancestors that yet were no different. Fire was a spectacle, a warning, a temptation. It could lure you in with the promise of warmth, light, and food, then kill you before you understood what you were dealing with. We sometimes imagine that our ancestors were fearless in the face of danger, but survival often depends on knowing when to hold back. Those who respected the fire's distance lived longer. Those who didn't, well, they didn't pass on their wisdom. Still, little by little, the gap between fear and curiosity began to narrow. There must have been moments when an ember rolled away from the main blaze, still glowing, still hot, but not guarded by walls of flame. Perhaps it was picked up with a stick, or simply watched until it died. Each encounter taught something new. You can almost picture it, a small group huddled in the dark, rain dripping from their hair, watching a tree burn in the distance. One of them shifts closer not recklessly, but deliberately. They squat low, hand outstretched, feeling the edge of the heat. It's dangerous. but it's also the most alive they've felt in weeks. Archaeological evidence tells us that early humans interacted with fire long before they could create it. Charred bones, burned plant seeds, and scorched earth appear in sites hundreds of thousands of years old, but there's no sign they were striking stones or spinning sticks to start those flames. The pattern is always the same: the fire came first, and humans arrived after. Borrowed, not invented. The ability to keep fire alive once you had it, that was the first real leap. But in these earliest days, the relationship was purely opportunistic. You didn't wait for a storm because you wanted a campfire. You waited because you needed it to survive, and if the storm never came, you went without. That dependency shaped everything. Migration patterns often followed lightning-prone landscapes. Seasonal camps were chosen near places where natural burns were common. Entire groups learned to read the sky not for beauty, but for the chance of a gift. And here's the cruel part: sometimes the fire came when you didn't need it. At the height of summer, when heat was already oppressive, a blaze could drive you from your water source, destroy the plants you relied on, and fill the air with choking smoke. In those times, the fire was not a gift at all. It was a thief. This dual nature life-giver and life-taker would become the heart of our relationship with fire. We never forgot that it could turn on us, even when, much later, we learned to strike it into existence. The memory of its danger remained. You can still see it in myths from cultures around the world. Fire as a stolen treasure, a jealous god, a power granted only under strict rules. But in these early chapters, the rules were simple. The fire appeared. You took what you could, and you stayed alive as long as possible. Think about the patience that required. You couldn't demand fire. You couldn't summon it with effort or skill. You had to wait for it. Like a hunter waits for prey, a beggar waits for charity. And when it came, you had to treat it with the same care you'd give to something sacred and unpredictable. Perhaps that's why, even now, a part of us still feels awe when we stare into flames. It's not just the light or the warmth, it's the recognition of something older than our species, something we once approached with cautious hunger, standing just far enough away to survive. Because in those days, warmth out of reach was better than warmth that killed you. Better to shiver another night than to gamble and lose everything in a single step. Some nights, we woke cold, and stayed that way for months. It wasn't the kind of cold you can chase away with movement. This cold had weight. It sat on your chest when you tried to sleep, pressed into your bones until they ached. Your breath felt sharp, as if the air had teeth. Without fire, the night belonged to other things. The darkness was not silent leaves shifting, twigs snapping, distant footsteps that might be wind, might be hunger. Your eyes strained for movement. Your ears twitched at every sound, but there was no light to make sense of what you heard. In these months without fire, survival meant layers of instinct. You curled yourself into the smallest shape possible to trap what heat you could. You pressed your body against another, not for affection, but for the desperate economy of warmth. It didn't matter if the other person was family, friend, or rival. The cold was a currency no one could afford to waste. Sometimes, the cold was patient. It waited for hunger to weaken you, for fatigue to make your hands clumsy, for illness to settle into your lungs. It didn't kill quickly. It worked like water on stone slow, certain, irreversible. In those stretches of dark, the memory of fire became sharper than any physical need. You could remember the smell of smoke in your hair, the orange glow against your eyelids when you drifted to sleep, the way your hands stopped shaking once they'd been stretched toward the heat. Those memories were warm in themselves, but they weren't enough to keep you alive. And so, without fire, you adjusted. You moved less to conserve energy. You hunted in short bursts, saving what little strength you had. You ate food raw not because you liked it, but because you couldn't risk the journey to find a blaze. Your teeth worked harder, your stomach churned longer, and sometimes you were sick for days. There are archaeological layers that tell this part of the story without words, bones scored with marks from stone tools, showing meat stripped quickly, plant remains with fibres torn instead of softened by heat. No ash, no char, no signs of a hearth, just the blunt evidence of a world lived in shadow and cold. Every once in a while, nature gave you a false promise, a pale light on the horizon that turned out to be the moon. Not fire, or the smell of smoke that faded before you could find its source, you learned to chase these signs anyway, because one success a single night with fire could mean survival for weeks. In this long dark, the idea of owning fire was laughable. You didn't own food, either. You didn't own shelter. Everything was borrowed from the land, used quickly, returned without ceremony. Fire was no different. If you found it, you treated it like a living thing, fed it, guarded it, prayed it wouldn't leave. But most of the time, you simply lived without it. And here's the cruel paradox: the longer you went without fire, the less prepared you were to keep it if you found it. Your tools dulled from cutting raw meat, your body weakened from the cold, your senses dulled in the monotony of dark. If fire appeared, you might not even have the energy to reach it before it died. It's strange to think that some of the earliest inventions were not things we made from nothing, but ways of holding on to what nature gave us for free. Before fire-making, there was fire-keeping, but before fire-keeping, there was this endurance. Months without warmth shaped our species in ways we don't fully understand. It taught us patience, because waiting was not optional. It taught us cooperation, because two bodies were warmer than one, and it taught us the sharp value of opportunity, because in a life like this, chance was everything. When the cold was at its deepest, there was no telling if you'd see another fire in your lifetime. Imagine that your world's so small, your years so uncertain, that a lightning strike in your valley could be the only flame you'd ever stand near. The idea that future generations would have fire at will without storms, without permission, would have seemed like fantasy. So you waited, and while you waited, you remembered. You told stories about the last time you'd seen fire, because the telling kept the image alive. You described the way it danced, the sound it made when wood cracked, the way it threw shadows taller than the trees themselves. These stories were more than entertainment. They were instruction manuals for a moment that might never come again. And maybe that was the first ember we truly carried, not in our hands, but in our minds, the ember of memory. Because even in the coldest months, even when the night was long and the air cut like stone, you could close your eyes and see the fire again. Not to warm your body, but to keep alive the idea that warmth was possible. That ember was passed down as carefully as any tool, from one mouth to another, across seasons, across lifetimes. And when fire finally appeared again, those who had carried its memory were ready. They knew to feed it. They knew to guard it. They knew to sit close, but not too close. Without those months of cold, we might not have learned that discipline. Without that hunger for warmth, we might not have valued it enough to keep. Some nights, we woke cold, and stayed that way for months. But in those months, something else stayed alive too. The ember we carry. Ash isn't waste. It's a blanket for a sleeping flame. That lesson may have been the first true human magic, not creating something new, but learning that what looked dead wasn't always gone. Picture it: the fires burned low. The flames are gone, replaced by a grey mound, soft and harmless looking. A cold wind brushes over it, and you think it's finished. But somewhere underneath that pale layer, tiny specks still glow dim as old stars, but alive. If you dig too quickly, the ember gasps and dies. If you don't dig at all, the cold will finish what the wind started. But if you push the ash over it gently, like tucking in a child, you trap the heat. You keep it sleeping, and in the morning, if you feed it the right kind of grass or bark, it wakes. No lightning, no waiting for storms, just yesterday's fire, still breathing under the skin of ash. For our ancestors, this was a revelation. It didn't mean independence from nature, not yet. You still needed a spark from somewhere, but it meant that once you had that spark, you could stretch it for days, maybe even weeks. The first hearths weren't the tidy circles of stones we imagine. They were more like scars on the ground, blackened patches where someone had learned to protect the coals from wind and rain. Sometimes they used hollowed logs, sometimes pits in the earth. Sometimes the fire was carried inside thick bark, wrapped and tied with plant fibers. Evidence of these early fire-keeping methods is faint but persuasive burn marks in layers of soil. Not just in one spot, but in a continuous line, suggesting the fire moved with the people. Archaeologists have found charred wood inside ancient animal bones, perhaps used as natural fire containers. It's hard to say exactly when or where this knowledge spread, but once it did, our relationship with fire changed forever. Because now, fire could travel. Think about what that meant for survival. Before, you were tethered to the places where fire appeared naturally. Now, you could leave. You could follow the herds, cross colder lands, venture into forests that never saw lightning. You could bring the sun with you, hidden in a bundle of ashen bark. But it wasn't easy. An ember is a fragile thing. Too much air, and it bursts into flame too early, too little, and it dies silently. You had to learn its moods, feed it without waking it, carry it without smothering it. This was not just a skill, it was a responsibility. Imagine the tension of being the one chosen to carry the ember. Every step, you check it. Every rest, you guard it. If the wind changes, you shield it with your body. If rain falls, you cover it with your hands. The lives of everyone you travel with depend on your success. And if it dies in your care, there is no second chance. That's the other truth about early firekeeping. It was as much about trust as it was about skill. The ember keeper was not just someone good with hands. They were someone the group believed would not make mistakes. It's easy to romanticize this, but think about the pressure. Days of walking with smoke clinging to your clothes, the smell of char in your hair, sleeping light because you're afraid a stray ember will fall, or that you'll wake to find your bundle cold and useless. But if you succeeded, the reward was more than warmth. It was safety from predators. It was cooked food that was easier to chew and digest. It was light in the darkness, long after the sun had gone. Keeping an ember alive wasn't just about not freezing, it was about holding a piece of power that no other animal on Earth had. Wolves could frighten prey, but they could not carry fire. Birds could travel vast distances, but they could not bring light with them. Only we could. Of course, fire was still not truly ours. We could not yet make it from nothing. We could only stretch its life. The ember was still a loan from nature, and nature could take it back at any moment. One unexpected rainstorm, one clumsy fall, one wrong move, and you were back in the cold. But those moments when the ember survived, they must have felt like miracles. A living thing you could not eat, could not drink, but could not live without. And here's something worth noting in almost every culture. Fire later became a symbol of life itself, not just because it warmed and cooked, but because it was fragile. It needed attention. Neglect it, and it was gone. Cherish it, and it could outlast the oldest in your group. In the time before fire-making, ash was the thread that connected one flame to the next. Without it, every fire was an isolated event. With it, every fire became a chapter in a longer story, one that could cross seasons, landscapes, and generations. And maybe that's why, even now, some part of us finds comfort in the sight of glowing coals. They are the in-between state, not as fierce as flames, not as dead as ashes. They are possibility, because under the ash, the fire is only sleeping. And if you know how to wake it, it will follow you anywhere. Carrying fire meant carrying risk, and not all of it burned in the open. When you walked with an ember in your pack, you weren't just moving warmth, you were moving danger. The ember was small, almost invisible under its blanket of ashen bark, but it had a will of its own. One careless jolt could spill it into dry grass. One gust of wind could fan it into a spark, and a spark in the wrong place was the start of something no one could control. Imagine trudging through a field of last year's grass, brittle and yellow, the stalks rattling against your legs. You're focused on the road ahead, on the next water source, on the slow ache in your calves. Behind you, a faint orange flicker appears where you brushed past. No one notices until the smell changes smoke, sharper and hungrier than the one you carry. By the time you turn, the grass is already a wall of fire. The wind leans into it, pushing it toward you. Your ember may have been your greatest asset a moment ago, but now the fire is everywhere, not in your control, not in your care. You drop your bundle and run. The thing you've guarded for days is abandoned in the dirt because now the only survival is distance. Some groups didn't survive those accidents. Archaeological sites show layers of sudden burn, entire camps blackened, tools cracked from heat, bones scorched where they lay. Fire was a gift, but it never stopped being a predator, even without accidents. The ember was a constant risk. The warmth that kept you alive also announced you to others. Smoke drifted farther than scent, visible even in the far hills. Predators could follow it. So could other humans. Think about that in a time when food and shelter were scarce. Fire wasn't just a sign of comfort, it was a beacon saying, "Here we are. We have something you don't." Sometimes, strangers approached cautiously, offering meat or skins in exchange for a share of the flame. Other times, they came silently, weapons ready, because taking fire was easier than making peace. The Ember Keeper was not only a craftsman but also a guard, and inside the group, the Ember created its own tensions. If it was lost, who was to blame? If the Keeper fell ill, who took over? If two people knew how to tend it, whose method was trusted? The Ember was small enough to fit in your hands, yet heavy enough to strain alliances. There are stories, fragments preserved in oral traditions, that suggest fire theft was one of the earliest crimes. Not stealing wood, not stealing food, stealing the ember itself. Imagine waking to find the bundle gone, its faint glow disappearing into the trees in someone else's hands. The cold that followed wasn't just physical, it was betrayal. Carrying fire also meant carrying the burden of vigilance. You could never truly rest. At night, you slept with the bundle against your chest, waking at every shift in the wind. During the day, you kept it in your shadow, turning your body to shield it from sudden drafts. It was like walking with a child who never slept and could kill you if you let it out of your sight. And yet, no one gave up the ember willingly. Even knowing the dangers, you held on to it, because the alternative was worse, a return to the months of cold, the raw meat, the endless waiting for lightning. We sometimes think of early humans as reckless adventurers, charging into danger without thought. But in truth, survival was a balance sheet. Every step with the ember was a calculation. How close you could pass to dry brush, how far you could travel without tending it, how much weight you could add to keep it safe. Over time, we learned to adapt the ember's risks to our advantage. Travelling near water reduced the danger of accidental burns. Building small windshields from bark or hide kept sparks from escaping. Assigning more than one person as keeper meant that if one ember died, another might live. But even with precautions, fire kept its own counsel. It was a living force that refused full obedience. Sometimes it grew when you needed it small. Sometimes it shrank when you begged it to live. It did not care about your hunger, your children, or your journey. And maybe that's why fire has always been treated with a mix of reverence and suspicion in human cultures. We never fully trusted it, even when it became part of our daily lives. Somewhere deep down, we remembered these early years when the ember in your hands could save your people or erase them. The risks we carried were more than physical. They were social, political, emotional. Fire gave us power, but it also gave us something else, the first taste of responsibility for a thing we could not create. And that responsibility changed us. We began to plan routes not just for food and water, but for safe ember travel. We chose campsites based on wind direction. We developed hand signals for danger that didn't involve shouting, because shouting drew attention. Every step was shadowed by two possibilities, warmth or ruin. And somewhere along the way, perhaps without even realizing it, we began to think of the ember not just as a tool or a gift, but as part of us. The group's survival was tied to its survival. When it glowed, we glowed. When it died, part of us died too. That was the real risk we carried. We like to think we found fire, but sometimes it found us. You can smell it before you see it. A strange heaviness in the air, a sharp bite in the back of your throat. The wind feels warmer than it should, even as the sun dips low. Birds break from the trees, screaming. Somewhere far off, there's a sound like the sky tearing. Then the glow appears. Not the friendly orange of a hearth, but a rolling red that swallows the horizon. The forest isn't just burning, it's moving. If you've ever seen a wildfire from the ground, you know it doesn't walk toward you, it runs. It leaps from branch to branch, finds the driest thing in its path, and devours it in seconds. The wind bends in its favor. Even the air seems to feed it. In these moments, fire isn't a tool, or a gift, or even an enemy you can fight. It's a force of nature so large that the only sensible response is to get out of its way. Early humans learned that lesson the hard way. Campsites buried under sudden layers of ash tell the story tools half finished. Food abandoned mid-preparation. Bones scattered in patterns that suggest panic. The fire didn't wait for them to prepare. It arrived without invitation, took what it wanted, and left nothing alive. But wildfires were more than destruction. They were also opportunity. If you could survive the first wave, the roar, the heat, the choking air, what came after could be a gift. Fire cleared the land. It drove animals into the open. It cracked hard seeds, making them edible. And it left behind a feast for scavengers, roasted carcasses, still steaming in the ash. For some, that meant risk was worth the approach. After the flames moved on, humans crept into the smoking ruins of the forest, feet sinking into warm soot. The ground still hissed in places, the air still shimmered, but in the blackened silence, there was food already cooked. Of course, this was no gentle harvest. The same heat that made the meat tender could blister your skin in seconds. The embers underfoot could ignite again with the wrong gust. Predators had also learned to follow the burn. They arrived fast, jaws open, eyes bright with the same hunger you felt. This was one of the earliest dances we had with fire chasing it and fleeing from it, in the same breath. Sometimes, we didn't have a choice. The wind could turn suddenly, trapping us between two advancing fronts. Rivers and lakes became escape routes, but not everyone could swim. High ground could save you from the flames but expose you to the smoke. Survival often came down to instinct and luck in this game was never a guarantee. Yet every time fire found us, it taught us something new. We learned to read the color of smoke to guess how close the flames were. We learned to watch animals, whose movements told us when to run before we could smell danger. We learned that certain landscapes dense with resinous trees or bone-dry grass were more dangerous than others. We also learned something about ourselves, that fear and desire could live side by side. We feared fire's speed, its noise, its hunger, but we desired what it left behind: warmth, light, food, and, if we were lucky, an ember we could take with us. It's possible that some of the first embers we carried came not from campfires we made or kept alive, but from the wreckage of forests we barely escaped. A branch still glowing at the tip, a chunk of charcoal hidden under a log. These were the spoils of survival, dangerous to collect, priceless to own. And so, the relationship deepened. Fire didn't just appear when we wanted it. It arrived on its own terms. Sometimes, it came as a wall of destruction. Other times, as a trail of glowing gifts in the ash. We didn't summon it. We didn't control it. We followed it like scavengers, ran from it like prey, and courted it like something holy. This is why so many ancient myths describe fire as stolen from a god, or bargained for with a trick. Not because we literally believed a divine figure guarded it, but because, in practice, it felt true. Fire had the arrogance of something that chose when to appear, and often demanded payment in lives before it left us anything we could use. When fire found us, it forced choices no other force in nature did. Run, and you might lose your only chance for warmth that season. Stay, and you might lose everything else. Some of us became good at walking that line, staying close enough to take, far enough to live, but no matter how skilled we became, the truth stayed the same. Fire had the final say, and maybe that's why. Even now, when we see a wildfire on the horizon, part of us feels something older than fear. A memory of the times we stood in the same glow, hearts pounding, weighing the same choice: flee or follow. Because the fire still finds us. It always will. At some point, we got tired of waiting. Waiting for lightning. Waiting for wildfires. Waiting for another camp to share. For generations. We had lived like tenants of a moody landlord, never sure when the lease would be renewed. Every ember we carried was a loan, every flame a temporary favour. But slowly, a question began to creep in. What if we could make it? It wasn't a sudden thought. It arrived in fragments, like sparks in the dark. Maybe it began when someone noticed the way stones struck together made a brief, bright flash. Maybe it came from the sight of trees rubbing in the wind until their branches smoked, or from the knowledge that heat and friction could change things. The way a stick spun quickly against a hide made it warm to the touch. At first, these were just observations. No one thought you could coax a flame from them. But the idea settled in if fire could appear without lightning. Maybe it could appear without the sky at all. The earliest attempts must have been desperate, awkward things. 2 stones smashed together until fingers ached, hoping the tiny spark would land on something dry. Sticks twisted between palms until blisters formed, only to produce nothing but dust. Hours of work with nothing to show but sore hands and the smell of hot wood. But sometimes, or rarely, it worked. A spark fell on the right kind of tinder something, fibrous and bone-dry, and the fibres glowed, then smoked, then flared. The first time this happened, it must have felt like pulling the sun out of your own body. Not stolen, not begged for made. It's hard to overstate the difference this made, even in its earliest, clumsiest form. No more waiting for storms, no more creeping into burned forests, no more risking theft from strangers. Fire could be born in your camp, on your terms, but the skill wasn't universal. Not everyone could do it, and even those who could didn't always succeed. Moisture in the air, dampness in the tinder, the wrong kind of wood, all of these could betray the effort. In some seasons, it was still faster to borrow an ember than to make a new one. This meant that the first fire makers became valuable in a new way. They weren't just keepers, they were creators. A group with a fire maker could travel farther, settle in places where lightning was rare, survive winters that would have killed them before. But it also meant that the person with the skill had power. And power, as always, invited tension. Did they teach the skill freely? Did they guard it? Did they demand something in return? In some groups, the knowledge might have been shared openly, passed from elder to youth without hesitation. In others, it might have been guarded like a secret, a way to ensure the firemaker's importance could never be replaced. Over time, the methods improved. We learned that certain stones flint, chert made better sparks, that certain woods dry, resinous caught faster, that some plants made tinder so fine it seemed to want to burn. We learned to build nests of these fibres, to breathe gently on the first smoke, to feed the flame before it could die of hunger. And yet, even as we learned to make fire, we didn't forget the old ways. We still kept embers in ash, still guarded them on long journeys. Firemaking was not yet easy or certain enough to replace firekeeping. The two skills coexisted, one born of patience, the other of ambition. The emotional shift was subtle but enormous. For the first time, fire was not just something that happened to us. It was something we could chase, catch, and keep. It changed how we thought about the world. If we could summon fire from stone and wood, what else could be coaxed into existence? What other gifts of nature could be persuaded to come when called? This was the seed of technology, not the tools themselves, but the belief that the world's forces could be persuaded, tamed, even created. But the first firemakers also learned another truth: making fire was not the same as owning it. A spark might be born in your hands, but once it grew into flame, it had the same wild heart as any other. It could warm you or burn you, feed you, or consume everything you had. We learned this the hard way. Early fires made in the wrong place could spread faster than we could run. A spark meant for cooking could leap to the shelters. A careless ember could erase a camp in a night. And so, even in our triumph, the old humility remained. Fire was now ours to make, but never ours to control completely. It was still a relationship, still a negotiation, only now. We were the ones starting the conversation. Looking back, it's easy to see this as the moment we crossed a threshold. But in the moment, it probably felt fragile, uncertain. A skill half learned, a promise half kept. Some nights, we still went cold. Some journeys still ended in darkness. But the balance had shifted. We were no longer just borrowers. We were beginning to be makers. And from that moment, the ember we carried wasn't only yesterday's, it could be tomorrow's too. If making fire was our first act of magic, cooking was our first act of transformation. For hundreds of thousands of years, our teeth had been our only knives, our stomachs the only furnace we knew. We tore meat in strips, swallowed roots that fought us all the way down, gnawed bones until our jaws ached. Survival was work you did with your face. Then, one night, someone, maybe by accident, maybe by design, placed food in the fire, not too close, or it burned, not too far, or nothing happened, just close enough for the heat to creep in. The change was instant, if you were paying attention. Meat that had been tough as hide softened. The smell rose in clouds you could almost taste before you swallowed. Fat melted and hissed, dripping into the coals, sending up sparks that lit the watcher's face. When they bit into it, the transformation was more than flavour. It was possibility. The food didn't fight the teeth it yielded. It didn't sit like a rock in the belly, it warmed you from the inside. Cooking wasn't just about taste. It was about time. Meat that took hours to chew could now be eaten in minutes. Roots that once had to be pounded or fermented for days could be softened in the span of a conversation. That meant less time eating, more time doing anything else. And here's the quiet truth that anything else might have been the beginning of culture. Because cooking gave us more than food, it gave us evenings. Instead of scattering to forage alone until dark, people gathered at the fire. They shared the heat, the smell, the light. They could see each other's faces, hear each other's voices without the constant noise of chewing or cracking bones. It's easy to imagine those first shared meals, a circle of bodies in the glow, smoke threading through hair, laughter breaking as someone drops their meat into the coals and scrambles to save it. The youngest leaning close to watch the juices bubble, the oldest leaning back, remembering a time when food was just work. Cooking also changed our bodies. Softer food meant smaller jaws, shorter teeth, less need for massive chewing muscles. That freed up space in the skull space our brains slowly claimed. Some scientists believe this shift, over thousands of generations, made room for more complex thought, language, and memory. In other words, the first meal cooked over a fire may have started a chain reaction that made us who we are. But the change wasn't all gentle. Fire made food safer, cooking killed parasites and softened toxins, but it also made it more desirable. The smell of roasting meat travelled far. It was an announcement to the dark. Here is food. Here are people. Here is fire. Predators followed that smell. So did other humans. And not all of them came to share. The hearth was warmth and safety for those in the circle. But it was also a beacon for those outside it. So we learned to guard the fire as we cooked, to place watchers at the edge of the light. The same flames that made us gather could also make us scatter if danger came too close. Still, the trade was worth it. With cooking, we could eat things we had never dared before. Tubers too bitter raw became sweet. Grains too hard to chew became porridge. Even bones became food, the marrow roasted inside them, rich and soft. Every new flavour was a discovery. Every discovery was a reason to keep the fire alive. The ember wasn't just survival now, it was comfort, pleasure, community. And with that comfort came stories. We don't know the first one told around a fire, but we can guess its shape, a retelling of the hunt that brought the meat. A warning about the predator who stole from the last camp. A boast, a joke, a memory. Fire didn't just change what we ate, it changed where we spent our words. The fire became the centre, not just of the camp, but of our attention. We faced it when we talked, turned to it when we thought. It lit the hands that shaped tools, the eyes that watched children, the faces we learned to read in the half-light. And maybe that's why, even now, a campfire can make strangers speak like old friends. Some part of us remembers that this is where we first learned to speak without the weight of hunger in our mouths. The first meals were more than food, they were an agreement. You tend the fire, I'll tend the meat. You watch the shadows, I'll watch the children. You share your portion, I'll share mine. Fire made us feed each other, and feeding each other made us human. It's tempting to think that once we cooked our first meal, the path to everything else, villages, cities, ovens, was inevitable. But it wasn't. Fire could still be lost. Storms could still drown the coals. Raids could still scatter the embers into the dirt. That's why. Even in the age of cooking, the ember we carried was sacred. It was not just the promise of heat, it was the promise of the next meal, the next gathering, the next night we would survive together. And we never forgot what it meant to lose it. When something keeps you alive, it also makes you worth killing. Fire had always been valuable. But when we learned to cook, it became more than warmth and light. It became the difference between thriving and starving. That made it worth guarding and worth taking. It's easy to imagine the first theft, A group moving through the night, their own embers long dead, their stomachs tight with hunger. They see the glow ahead, smell the meat, hear the voices. They know the rules of approach, call out, show your hands, offer something in trade. But this night, they don't have anything to offer, and maybe they're too cold, too hungry to care about the rules. They slip into the shadows around the camp, eyes fixed on the bundle by the hearth. It's small, just ash and bark wrapped around a coal, but it's enough to light their own fire. Enough to change their next week, maybe their next month. One quick grab, one silent retreat, and they vanish into the dark. When the theft is discovered, the loss is more than physical. It's humiliation. The ember wasn't just fuel, it was proof you could protect your own. To lose it meant you had failed, and everyone knew what failure in the wild meant. So the next time, the group doesn't wait to be robbed. They build their hearth in the center, sleep in a ring around it. Spears lie within arm's reach, and when strangers come, they are met far from the light. Sometimes that meeting ends in trade, sometimes in blood. The fights for fire weren't always planned. Sometimes two groups would stumble upon the same patch of dry wood, or the same fresh kill, and the argument over meat became an argument over who deserved the flame to cook it. In those moments, fire was both the prize and the excuse. Anthropologists looking at ancient bones find marks that suggest more than hunting accidents. Blunt force trauma, deep cuts in places that make no sense for animal attacks. These wounds tell a story that violence between humans is as old as the glow in our hearths. And yet, the same fire that drove us to fight could also force us to unite. In the dead of winter, when no one could risk losing their ember, even enemies sometimes sat at the same fire. There are stories, half history, half legend of groups setting down their weapons for a single night, sharing cooked food under an unspoken agreement. Tomorrow we may fight, but tonight we keep the cold away together. Still, those truces were rare. More often, fire drew lines. Your hearth or ours, your ember or ours. The ember keepers became high-value targets in these conflicts. In some groups, they were guarded like children. In others, they were the first to be taken in a raid. Kill the keeper, and the ember dies with them. Take the keeper alive, and you control the fire for as long as they breathe. These fights didn't just shape our bodies, they shaped our minds. We learned to think strategically about resources, to assess risk versus reward. We learned deception, ambush, intimidation, all for the same small glow in the ash. And as the stakes grew, so did the rituals. Some groups marked their hearths with stones or bones, warning others away. Some smeared ash on their faces, believing it would give them the fire's strength in battle. Some treated the ember as a living being, feeding it before themselves, speaking to it as they would to an ancestor. Because in a way, that's what it was. The ember was a link to all the fires before it. All the nights survived, all the meals shared. To lose it wasn't just a setback, it was a break in the chain. These were the first wars, in miniature, not over land, not over gods, but over the thing that made both worth having. And even now, in a world where we can light a flame with a flick of a switch, part of us remembers what it was like to guard that ember with our lives. Part of us understands that the warmth we enjoy now was once a prize taken from another's hands. Fire gave us light to see each other by. It also gave us reasons to see each other as enemies. Motif tie-in, the ember we carry now includes its role as a contested resource, both a unifying force and a cause for violence. Next part lead-in. But not all battles for fire were fought with weapons. Some were fought with stories. When something keeps you alive, it also makes you worth killing. Fire had always been valuable, but when we learned to cook, it became more than warmth and light. It became the difference between thriving and starving. That made it worth guarding, and worth taking. It's easy to imagine the first theft. A group moving through the night, their own embers long dead, their stomachs tight with hunger. They see the glow ahead, smell the meat, hear the voices. They know the rules of approach, call out, show your hands, offer something in trade. But this night, they don't have anything to offer, and maybe they're too cold, too hungry to care about the rules. They slip into the shadows around the camp, eyes fixed on the bundle by the hearth. It's small, just ash and bark wrapped around a coal, but it's enough to light their own fire. Enough to change their next week, maybe their next month. One quick grab, one silent retreat, and they vanish into the dark. When the theft is discovered, the loss is more than physical. It's humiliation. The ember wasn't just fuel, it was proof you could protect your own. To lose it meant you had failed, and everyone knew what failure in the wild meant. So the next time, the group doesn't wait to be robbed. They build their hearth in the centre, sleep in a ring around it, spears lie within arm's reach, and when strangers come, they are met far from the light. Sometimes that meeting ends in trade, sometimes in blood. The fights for fire weren't always planned. Sometimes, two groups would stumble upon the same patch of dry wood, or the same fresh kill, and the argument over meat became an argument over who deserved the flame to cook it. In those moments, fire was both the prize and the excuse. Anthropologists looking at ancient bones find marks that suggest more than hunting accidents. Blunt force trauma, deep cuts in places that make no sense for animal attacks. These wounds tell a story that violence between humans is as old as the glow in our hearths, and yet, the same fire that drove us to fight could also force us to unite. In the dead of winter, when no one could risk losing their ember, even enemies sometimes sat at the same fire. There are stories, half history, half legend of groups setting down their weapons for a single night, sharing cooked food under an unspoken agreement. Tomorrow we may fight, but tonight we keep the cold away together. Still, those truces were rare. More often, fire drew lines. Your hearth or ours, your ember or ours. The ember keepers became high-value targets in these conflicts. In some groups, they were guarded like children. In others, they were the first to be taken in a raid. Kill the keeper, and the ember dies with them. Take the keeper alive, and you control the fire for as long as they breathe. These fights didn't just shape our bodies, they shaped our minds. We learned to think strategically about resources, to assess risk versus reward. We learned deception, ambush, intimidation, all for the same small glow in the ash. And as the stakes grew, so did the rituals. Some groups marked their hearths with stones or bones, warning others away. Some smeared ash on their faces, believing it would give them the fire's strength in battle. Some treated the ember as a living being, feeding it before themselves, speaking to it as they would to an ancestor. Because in a way, that's what it was. The ember was a link to all the fires before it. All the nights survived, all the meals shared. To lose it wasn't just a setback, it was a break in the chain. These were the first wars, in miniature, not over land, not over gods, but over the thing that made both worth having. And even now, in a world where we can light a flame with a flick of a switch, part of us remembers what it was like to guard that ember with our lives. Part of us understands that the warmth we enjoy now was once a prize taken from another's hands. Fire gave us light to see each other by. It also gave us reasons to see each other as enemies. Fire doesn't travel well. But we learned to make it a traveller. In the beginning, we had two choices: stay near the hearth, or risk losing it. The ember was fragile, too much wind, and it died. Too little air, and it smothered. A rainstorm could erase weeks of survival in minutes. But people move, seasons change, herds migrate, and we needed fire to follow us. So we learned to carry it. The simplest way was the most ancient cradle, the ember in ash. Ash insulated it, kept it warm without letting it burn too fast. Wrapped in dry leaves or bark, tucked into a hollowed-out horn or shell, it could ride for hours, but it still had to be fed tilted for air, checked for heat, given a sliver of dry grass if it began to fade. It was a delicate balance. Too much feeding, and it flared, burning through its container. Too little, and it cooled into lifeless black. To carry an ember was to carry a heartbeat. You checked it often, worried over it, whispered to it without realizing. Over time, we built better cradles, clay pots with lids to keep out the wind, bundles of fungus and moss that smouldered slowly, releasing a steady heat for days. Some of the most prized tools in early human camps weren't weapons or ornaments, they were fire carriers. A group might have only one or two, and they were guarded like treasure. And they were. An ember in a pot was more than a convenience, it was a shield against the unknown. On the open plain or deep in the forest, you could stop, gather wood, and have fire in minutes instead of hours. But carrying fire wasn't just practical, it became ceremonial. In some cultures, the ember was always carried by a specific person, the eldest woman, the chief's sibling, the one who had lit the last successful hearth. In others, it passed hand to hand during the journey, each person responsible for keeping it alive for a few hours before giving it to the next. These rituals were partly about logistics, partly about honour. To be trusted with the ember was to be trusted with the life of the group. People remembered who had kept it alive in the rain, and who had let it die. There were superstitions too. Some believed the ember absorbed the spirit of the land it passed through, and that it was dangerous to let a foreign ember into your hearth. Others believed that the same ember should never return to its starting place, that it carried the memory of the road, and that memory could bring trouble if it circled back. The longer the journey, the more the ember became a kind of silent passenger. It saw everything, but spoke only in its own language warmth when it was healthy, the faintest whiff of cold when it was dying. And there were moments when carrying it was the only thing that kept us going. A group soaked to the skin, miles from shelter, might walk faster just to keep the ember from fading. In those moments, fire wasn't just survival, it was purpose. There were failures, of course, nights when a sudden storm drenched everything, and the ember hissed into nothing. Days when the carrier stumbled crossing a river and came up empty-handed. In those moments, the loss was felt in the gut, like grief. The hearth would be cold until someone could make or beg a new flame, and everyone knew the risk that came with that weight. That's why some groups carried 2 embers, in separate containers, entrusted to different people. Redundancy, before the word existed. If one died, the other might live. Looking back, it's easy to see how this skill shaped the way we think about preservation. We learn to protect the vulnerable by surrounding it with what it needed most: warmth, shelter, attention. Carrying the ember taught us patience, taught us vigilance. It taught us that the smallest, quietest thing could be the most important. Even today, you can see the echo of this in how we treat certain things. We carry photographs in wallets, lockets around our necks, secrets in our pockets, not because they're heavy, but because they're irreplaceable. The ember was the first of these. It's strange to think that for thousands of years, humanity's greatest invention wasn't a weapon, a tool, or a building. It was a way to keep a spark alive between 2 sticks of wood. But that spark made every other invention possible. The ember we carried didn't just light our nights, it lit the road ahead. Light pushes back the dark. Before fire, night wasn't just the absence of day, it was the presence of everything we feared. The dark was thick, not the diluted grey you know from city streets or even moonlit forests. It was a substance, pressing in from all sides, alive with rustles, snaps, and breathing you couldn't place. When the sun fell, the rules of the world changed. Sight meant nothing. Your ears worked overtime. Your skin learned to read the air for movement. Sleep was a dangerous indulgence. You didn't close both eyes unless you had someone to keep watch. Then came fire. The first night a group kept it burning inside a cave must have felt like an act of rebellion. The flames licked the damp air, throwing shadows up the walls that danced like living things. The flicker was a heartbeat you could see. Light made the walls real. You could count the stones, see the faces of the people you trusted, watch the edges of the cave, where the dark waited like a patient predator. The animals noticed, too. Wolves kept their distance, circling just beyond the glow. Big cats watched from the tree line, blinking slow. They could smell the meat, hear the laughter, but they knew the heat. The sudden movement of flame was not theirs to challenge lightly. For the first time, we didn't just survive the night, we owned it. But that safety was thin. The fire had to be fed constantly. Like a nervous child you didn't dare leave alone. Too much wood and it smoked you out. Too little and the glow began to shrink, letting the dark leak back in. That's why in every group, someone was always awake. They sat cross-legged, turning logs, breaking kindling, blowing gently into the coals when they got lazy. It wasn't just duty, it was an unspoken pact. I will keep the light alive so you can close your eyes. You will keep it for me when I sleep. Sometimes, keeping watch meant listening to the slow breathing of those around you and knowing that each breath depended on the fire holding out until dawn. Other times, it meant staring at the entrance, daring anything outside to try crossing that line of light. Even in safety, there was vulnerability. A sudden wind could scatter sparks, or worse, pull the smoke back into the cave, choking sleepers before they woke. A heavy rain could turn the entrance into a dripping curtain, sending cold water to hiss and bite at the embers. So we learned to place the fire where it could breathe but not be drowned. We learned to bank the coals under layers of ash to keep them warm through the slow hours before sunrise. We learned that not every flame should be bright sometimes. A smoulder was safer. The rhythm of the night became a rhythm of light bright when someone fed it, then slowly dimming until the next stirring, the next crack of kindling, the next bloom of orange. Sung UDN. Each cycle was a reminder that nothing was permanent, that safety came in pulses, not guarantees. And yet, every pulse was a victory. Every hour of sleep taken under that wavering light was an act of defiance against the cold and the teeth outside. Children slept deeper in the glow, their faces turned toward it as if the fire itself were a parent. Elders found their bones ached less in the warmth, and though they still woke often, they could rest knowing they wouldn't be startled awake by claws in the dark. Fire didn't erase danger, it made space for rest in spite of it, and rest was power. A body that slept could run faster tomorrow, think clearer, lift more, fight longer. Sleep wasn't luxury, it was strategy. But light had another effect. More subtle and just as important, it gave the night a shape. Before fire, night was endless. With it, there was a centre, a point you could return to with your eyes closed. You could walk to the stream, gather wood, and find your way back by the glow alone. That glow was home, and home, for the first time, was more than where you lay your head. It was where light lived, where the shadows retreated, where your people were gathered. Even now, thousands of years later, you can feel it, how a single candle in a dark room draws the eye, how a campfire turns strangers into companions. Somewhere deep in our bones, we remember the cave, the watchers, the breathing circle around the flames. We remember that every night survived was a small victory against a world that didn't care if we woke up again. And maybe that's why we still sleep better with a light nearby, even if the door is locked and the predators are gone. A night light, a hallway bulb, the flicker of a TV in another room, they're the quiet descendants of the fire in the cave, still pushing back the dark, still buying us the courage to close our eyes. In those ancient caves, the fire didn't just warm us, it reminded us that we were more than prey, and that every dream we had under its light was another step toward being something else entirely. The fire gave us safety, but safety glows, and anything that glows in the dark gets seen. It started with animals. A distant glow meant heat, food scraps, bones with marrow still inside. Hyenas learned to watch from the shadows, waiting for someone to wander too far from the circle. Big cats followed the smell of cooked meat, an aroma that could travel far on a cold night. But animals weren't the only ones watching. In a world without cities, without constant human noise, a fire was the loudest thing in the landscape. It cracked, hissed, and popped in ways the night wasn't used to. Its light reached over rocks and trees, making a beacon against the horizon, and smoke could be seen for miles in daylight. Sometimes, that was exactly what we wanted, flee. A lost hunter could find their way back by spotting the smoke of their own camp. Allies knew where to meet. A fire could be a lighthouse in a sea of wilderness, but the same signal that called friends also called strangers, and strangers were unpredictable. Some came in peace, drawn by the promise of warmth and a share of food. They might bring stories, news from other lands, or tools to trade. Their arrival could turn a quiet night into a small festival. Others came with need, hunger in their bellies, cold in their bones. They didn't want to trade, they wanted to take. And some came with worse curiosity mixed with calculation. They saw not just a fire, but a group, a set of hands, maybe resources worth claiming. To them, the fire was both an invitation and a vulnerability. So we learned to read the dark beyond our light. The watcher's job wasn't just to feed the flames, but to keep eyes on the perimeter, to know the difference between an animal's pause and a human's deliberate stillness. If figures appeared at the edge of the glow, the first reaction was always the same. The firekeeper straightened, body blocking the flame. Fire wasn't given freely, not to strangers you hadn't measured yet. Sometimes, the negotiation was quick, a trade, a greeting, maybe even a shared meal before they melted back into the dark. Other times, the standoff lasted hours, both groups lit only by the same flicker, neither willing to step fully into it. There are old stories, half history, half warning about people who followed the wrong fire. They'd see a glow, approach with hope, and find not warmth, but an ambush. In these tales, the fire was bait, tended just enough to lure travellers into range. The predators weren't wolves, they were people. Because the truth was clear early on the moment you lit a fire, you declared your presence, and once declared, it couldn't be taken back. That's why some groups kept their fires small and shielded, burning just enough to keep warm but not enough to throw light too far. They built them in pits, surrounded by stone, or deep inside caves where the glow couldn't escape. Others did the opposite. They built massive bonfires as declarations of strength. We have fire, we have numbers, we're not afraid. These fires were less about survival and more about signalling power. And then there was smoke, the daytime equivalent of a torch at night. Even if your fire was hidden in the dark, the morning would betray you. A column of smoke rising into a still sky was as clear a mark as a flag. Some learned to burn certain woods to produce less smoke, or to bank their fires before dawn so the air above them stayed empty. Yet for all the risks, we couldn't give fire up. We just got better at living with its double edge. We learned to make decoy fires, small ones built away from camp to draw attention elsewhere. We learned to move the hearth deeper into the shelter when we needed to disappear. We learned that sometimes. The best light was none at all, but there was no escaping the fact that fire connected us. Whether you approached it or guarded it, it made you part of a wider web of eyes in the night, of drifting smoke in the day, of stories about who was out there and what they might want. The ember we carried was never truly ours alone. It was always part of the landscape, part of the night's map. If you had fire, you were a point on that map, visible to anyone who knew how to look. Even now, in cities lit by millions of artificial suns, we have echoes of that instinct. We draw curtains at night, dim porch lights, install motion sensors not because we fear the dark, but because we know light still carries a message someone is here. Back then, the message was simpler. Your fire meant you had heat, food, and shelter. It meant you had something worth approaching or worth taking. So every night, the fire in the cave wasn't just a comfort, it was a gamble. You pushed back the dark, but you also reached into it, and you never knew what might reach back. For most of our story, fire was a gift we guarded, not something we commanded. We stole it from lightning-struck trees, from smouldering grasslands, from the ruins of another camp. We carried it like a fragile inheritance, passed from one pair of hands to another. But there must have been a night quiet, windless, heavy with the smell of rain when someone realized they didn't need to wait for the sky to grant it. They could make it themselves. It didn't happen in a single revelation. It was years, centuries of accidents and stubbornness. A hunter sharpening a stone and seeing a spark leap into dry moss. A child rubbing two sticks together in boredom, surprised at the warmth blooming under their palms. A traveller watching the embers of a burned tree and wondering if they could coax the same heat from something smaller. Tamer. The first successes weren't clean. The sparks died more often than they caught. The sticks smoked but refused to flame. Fingers blistered. Tempers snapped. It's easy to imagine someone swearing the whole thing was impossible, that only lightning and the gods had the right to summon fire. But human patience has a way of grinding down impossibility. Eventually, someone found the right rhythm, the right stone against stone, the right wood against wood, and when that first self-made fire caught, it wasn't just a victory. It was a rewriting of the rules. Because now, fire was no longer only something you found, it was something you could create. That changed everything. No more waiting for storms. No more sending scouts to beg or steal from other camps. No more gambling that the ember you carried would survive the river crossing or the sudden downpour. But the skill was rare at first. Fire-making wasn't a trick you picked up in an afternoon. It demanded practice, precision, and the right materials: stones with enough bite to throw sparks, tinder dry enough to catch but fine enough to smoulder. A person who could make fire was more than useful. They were vital. Those who mastered it became keepers of a different kind of ember, not the glowing coal in a pot, but the knowledge in their hands. They were sought after, protected, maybe even feared. In some groups, only certain members were taught the method, guarding the secret like a weapon. In others, the skill was shared as widely as possible, so no one would ever again be without flame. With fire-making came a new kind of confidence. People began to camp in places they wouldn't have dared before: open plains, colder valleys, wind-swept ridges, knowing they could kindle warmth and light wherever they stopped. It also freed us to experiment, If a fire went out, it was no longer a disaster, it was an inconvenience. That meant we could risk using fire in new ways, burning brush to drive game, charring wood for tools, hardening spear points in the heat. But this control didn't erase the old habits overnight. The ember in the pot still travelled with us, because no matter how skilled you were, a rain-soaked tinder bundle was still useless. Fire-making was a backup, not yet a replacement, and the old reverence for flame didn't vanish either. Even when we could make it ourselves, fire still felt alive, unpredictable. You didn't summon it without care. It could feed you or burn your shelter to the ground. The first man-made fires must have drawn stares from those who saw them. Imagine watching someone strike 2 stones, and instead of the tiny dying glint you expected, you saw that glint land in dry grass, spread, and bloom into orange. It would feel like watching someone pull the sun out of a pocket. In time, the act became ritual. Lighting a fire marked the start of a hunt, the birth of a season, the beginning of a new camp. Young people might be tested on their fire-making skill as a rite of passage. In some places, it was tied to marriage, 2 families coming together to light a new hearth, symbolizing the warmth they would share. It wasn't just technology. It was a declaration we no longer wait for the world to give us what we need. Still, every fire-maker carried the weight of what they knew. A flame was never neutral. It could cook a meal or signal your position to someone watching from the dark. It could warm your children or destroy your shelter in a gust of wind. Making fire was power, and power was never simple. The ember we carried had always been fragile. Now, we carried the knowledge to birth it again and again. It was freedom, but it was also responsibility, because once you can create light, you must decide where to shine it and when, and that choice would shape the rest of human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, we carried fire like contraband, always guarding it, always fearing its loss. Then, one day, or more likely, many days over many generations, someone did the impossible. They made fire appear where there had been none. It probably didn't look dramatic. No lightning from the sky, no divine spark, just 2 stones, struck together, sending a brief glitter into dry grass, or 2 sticks rubbed until smoke bled from the fibres. But for the people watching, it might as well have been magic. In that moment, the ember we carried stopped being our only insurance. We could start from zero. At first, firemaking wasn't quick. It was skill, not trick. The person who could do it was rare part craftsman, part sorcerer. Their hands knew exactly how much pressure, how much speed, how much patience to summon the heat, and the tools mattered. The right stones, the right wood, the right tinder. You didn't just wander into the forest and try with whatever you found. The firemaker knew where to look, what to gather, how to keep it dry even in the wet season. Those who could make fire became central figures in their groups. Their role was half survival, half prestige. Without them, the group risked falling back into the old fear, losing the flame and having to beg or steal it back. With them, you could dare to let the hearth go cold, knowing it could be reborn. But skill doesn't erase caution. Even with fire-making, the ember remained a treasure. Why waste time and energy striking sparks when you could keep the coals alive? And besides, a storm, an injury, or bad luck could still make a firemaker's skills useless. Wet tinder was wet tinder. No matter how talented the hands, still, the shift had begun. The psychology of fire changed. It was no longer just an inheritance. It was a creation. It belonged to us in a new way. The social rules shifted too. Before, fire belonged to the group. It was dangerous to hoard it. Now, an individual could claim it. A young man might impress a partner by making a small fire away from the main camp. A leader could demonstrate power by lighting a hearth in front of rivals. Stories about the origin of fire began to change. Myths about stolen embers gave way to myths about heroes who discovered fire, who brought the secret to their people. In some tales, the hero was punished for giving it away because giving fire was giving power, and with power came risk. Groups with fire-making could travel farther, settle in colder places, challenge those who had once dominated them. They could refuse the terms of others. That changed the balance between tribes in ways that were sometimes bloody. There was ceremony too. In some places, the making of fire became part of rituals, coming-of-age trials, seasonal festivals, funerals. The act wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. To summon fire from nothing was to summon life itself, to declare that death hadn't won yet. But even with all this, there was one thing fire-making didn't change the watch. No matter how easily you could make a new flame, the one already burning still needed guarding. The hearth wasn't just heat, it was memory. People still preferred to keep it alive through the night, through the rain, through every migration. Making a new fire was impressive, but keeping the same fire alive was an act of devotion. And maybe that's why, even now, we still talk about keeping the flame in relationships, in work, in causes we care about. We could always start again, but we know the deepest connections are the ones we've kept lit for a long, long time. The ember we carried had changed shape. It could now be both born and reborn at will. And with that, humanity's relationship to the dark shifted forever. We no longer lived at its mercy. We could push it back whenever we wanted. But there was still one more transformation to come. Because once we could make fire anywhere, we began to wonder what else could we make it do. We didn't just make fire. We began to live around it. At first, the fire sat where it always had at the heart of the camp, the cave, the shelter. But once we could create it anywhere, we stopped treating it like a guest and started treating it like a permanent resident. The hearth became more than a pile of burning wood. It was the axis around which everything else turned. You placed your sleeping space close enough to feel the heat, but not so close that an ember could roll onto your furs. You stored tools where the light reached them, so you could find them in a hurry at night. Cooking transformed. Before, you might char meat over a quick blaze and eat it half raw before the fire went out. Now, with a steady hearth, you could roast slowly, boil water, dry berries into something that would last through winter. Whole diets changed not just in flavour, but in safety. Fire killed parasites, made roots edible, turned hard grains into something chewable. The circle around the flame became the place where stories were told. By day, you might work side by side without speaking much, each person focused on their task. But at night, when the fire drew everyone close, words came easier. You could speak without raising your voice, knowing the light held you together. It wasn't just practical, it was magnetic. The human face, lit from below by firelight, became a kind of moving art. Shadows climbed the walls like living murals, the orange glow catching in eyes and teeth. We began to decorate ourselves, not just for the hunt or for ritual, but for the way it would look in the fire's gaze. Communities began to shape themselves around the hearth. In caves, we cleared and smoothed the ground near it. In open camps, we built windbreaks and rings of stone. Later, we dug pits lined with clay to hold heat longer. The hearth became the anchor point, a landmark you could describe to someone returning from the hunt. We'll be by the fire when you get back. Even the rhythm of the day shifted. Without fire, night was a deadline. Work stopped when the sun fell. With it, evenings became their own territory. You could repair tools, tend to hides, teach a child to tie a knot or carve a point awl in the glow of the flames. And fire's warmth let us push into places we'd never have survived before. Higher altitudes, colder latitudes, wind-scoured plains. We could settle for seasons instead of days. Villages, even if temporary, began to form with the hearth as their centre. But perhaps the most profound change was invisible trust. Before, survival depended on constant vigilance. Sleep was taken in shifts, half the group awake while the other half rested. But with a controlled hearth, people could sleep closer together, in greater numbers, without fear of freezing or being picked off one by one. The circle of firelight became a circle of safety. That trust didn't come cheaply. The fire had to be managed, wood gathered, flames tended, sparks kept from jumping into dry grass. A neglected hearth could burn down an entire shelter in minutes. Keeping it was everyone's job, but some became specialists, the firekeepers. A firekeeper wasn't just a lookout. They were a steward. They decided when to add fuel and when to let the flames die down, when to move the fire to protect it from wind, when to bank it so it would last through the night. Because fire was alive in a way nothing else in our world was. Feed it, and it thrived. Starve it, and it withered. Anger it, and it destroyed. So we began to build not just around the flame, but for the flame. Storage for dry wood, pits for charcoal, spaces for ash, which could be used to clean hides, preserve food, even treat wounds. and as the fire shaped our settlements, it began to shape our minds. We thought in terms of home as wherever the hearth was. Even when we travelled, we carried the idea with us of future fire in a future place where we would gather again. You can see the shadow of that even now. In kitchens where families linger long after the meal is done, in campfires that hold friends in conversation long past midnight, in candles lit in windows, marking the place someone waits for you. Fire didn't just give us heat and light. It gave us a centre, a physical point that pulled us back together after the day's scattering. And in that centre, we learned to be more than survivors. We learned to be a community. Once the hearth was ours to keep, we started to wonder what else it could do. And we learned quickly, fire wasn't just a comfort, it was leverage. The first use of power was simple protection. A ring of flames kept predators away better than any wall of wood or stone. Lions and wolves would linger at the edge, their eyes like pale coins in the dark, unwilling to cross the heat and light. Even snakes, creatures that feared little, avoided the vibration of fire on the ground. But soon, we saw that power could go outward. Fire wasn't just a barrier, it was a weapon. A torch in hand could turn a lone hunter into something larger, brighter, more dangerous. A burning branch thrown into the brush could flush animals into traps. Entire herds could be driven toward our cliffs by setting fire to the grass behind them, the smoke pushing them forward. With that came a dangerous temptation using fire not just for survival, but for dominance. Against other humans, fire was a show of force. Charred ground sprouted fresh green growth that attracted grazing animals. Entire ecosystems shifted under the influence of our flames. But the power came with risk. A fire you set could turn on you. Wind changed. Embers jumped, and in hours the ground could be black and the air thick with ash. The same fire that defended your camp could erase it. And so, a new layer of skill emerged, not just making fire, but shaping it. We learned to read the wind, to feed flames in a way that guided their spread, to build breaks in grass or wood so the fire would stop where we wanted. Some people became masters of this, early fire tacticians. They could set a ring of small blazes that merged into a wall, trapping prey or defending a position. They could time a burn so that by morning the smoke had cleared, leaving fertile soil and no sign of their camp to outsiders. In time, this control fed into myth. Fire handlers were seen as part warrior, part magician. In some traditions, the one who could command the flames became a leader, not because they were strongest, but because they were dangerous in a way that muscle alone couldn't match. And with leadership came ritual. Fires were lit to mark territory, to signal alliances, to declare the start of a hunt or the end of a season. These blazes weren't about heat or cooking, they were statements, visible for miles, saying this land is spoken for. For the first time, fire wasn't just a survival tool, it was political. It gave the power to intimidate without touching, to reshape the land, to protect and to destroy in equal measure. And once we tasted that kind of power, we began to think of fire not as part of nature, but as something that belonged to us. That belief was dangerous too, because fire never really belonged to anyone. It was still wild at its core, still able to slip out of control, still able to take more than we meant to give. But by then, it was too late to go back. The hearth had become a throne, and the flame was no longer just a servant. It was a partner in our rise and a shadow over our future. By the time fire had become a weapon, it had already been something else, something quieter, deeper. Long before we learned to bend it into walls of flame or to drive herds with smoke, we had been sitting beside it, staring, because fire does something to the mind. You can be speaking, laughing, sharpening a tool, and then your eyes drift to the flames, and you fall silent. The light moves in patterns that are never the same twice. It feels alive, as if it's breathing with you. For early humans, that strangeness was enough to make fire seem not just useful, but otherworldly. It arrived from the sky in bolts of lightning, or crawled across the land in waves of heat you couldn't stop. It could vanish without warning or flare up without cause. It could change the taste of food, the smell of air, the feel of your own skin. It could destroy in hours what had taken years to build. That kind of power didn't stay in the realm of the ordinary, it slipped into the realm of the sacred. We began to treat fire with ritual. In some camps, the hearth was never allowed to go out not because we couldn't start another. but because the flame was considered the same flame, stretching back to an ancestor, a victory, or a gift from the gods. Firekeepers became more than practical specialists. They were priests, guardians of something that wasn't entirely human. To fail at keeping the flame wasn't just carelessness. It was a breach of trust, a sin against the group. We told stories about where fire came from. In some, it was stolen from an animal, a hawk or fox who carried embers in its beak or tail. In others, it was a gift from a divine figure, given in exchange for a promise or as a reward for bravery. And sometimes, the story warned that fire had been taken without permission, and that it would always be dangerous as a result. In these myths, fire was rarely ours by right. It was something we borrowed, something we had to tend carefully or risk losing forever. That idea stayed alive even as our technical skill grew. Rituals sprang up around fire's use. You lit it in a certain way before hunts, festivals, or funerals. Some cultures used 2 pieces of wood, some flint and steel, but always with an order, a respect, as though calling the flame in the wrong way might invite the wrong kind of spirit. The fire itself could mark time. Sacred flames burned for days or weeks to honor the dead or celebrate a season's turning. In some places, all household fires were extinguished at the year's end and rekindled from a single communal blaze, a reminder that everyone drew from the same source. Even the way we sat around fire became a ritual of its own. People took the same places each night, elders closest to the heat, children in the lap of its light. The stories told there weren't random. They were the old ones, the ones meant to be remembered, carried forward like the coals themselves. It's not hard to see why. Fire made the night smaller. The circle of light became the whole visible world, and beyond it was only shadow. In that shadow could be anything, predators, strangers, spirits. Inside the circle, there was warmth, food, the sound of voices. No wonder we began to think of fire as a kind of boundary between life and death, safety and danger, the known and the unknown. Some rituals blurred the line between the practical and the mystical. Ash from sacred fires might be smeared on the skin for protection or used to mark tools and weapons. Smoke was sent up to carry prayers. Flames were fed with certain woods or herbs thought to please ancestors or gods. And fire could also be a judge. Some traditions used it to test truth if you could hold your hand near the flame without flinching. You were innocent. If the fire burned you quickly, you were guilty, dangerous. Yes, but in a world where the supernatural felt as real as the physical, fire seemed a worthy witness. What's striking is how much of that survives. We still light candles in churches, temples, and grave sites. We still gather around bonfires for celebrations. We still speak of eternal flames and passing the torch. Maybe that's because, deep down, we haven't forgotten that first fear, that fire could disappear from our lives as suddenly as it arrived. Or maybe it's because we still feel that same pull when we stare into the coals, the same quiet sense that we're looking at something alive. Either way, by the time fire became a tool of war and power, it had already claimed a place in our minds as something holy, and that meant every use of it from cooking to conquest carried a shadow of reverence. We had made fire our ally, our weapon, our altar. But there was one more step to take, turning it into our engine. For most of our shared history, fire had been a companion, something we carried, fed, and sat beside. But there came a time when we stopped simply living with fire and began making it work for us. The first step was subtle. We noticed that clay placed near the edge of the hearth hardened instead of crumbling, that the tips of wooden spears held briefly in the flames became sharper, harder to break, that rocks heated in the fire could be used to boil water in baskets or animal stomachs, cooking food without letting it touch the flame at all. These were small tricks, but they planted an idea fire could change things. Soon, we were using it not just to prepare food, but to transform the world around us, shaping the earth. We learned to burn forests, not just to clear space for camps, but to open land for planting. Controlled burns released nutrients into the soil, and the fresh grass drew grazing animals. What had once been a dense, dangerous tangle became a meadow dotted with game. Charcoal born from slow-burning wood in carefully smothered pits became one of our most valuable materials. It burned hotter and longer than ordinary wood, opening the door to new work softening copper ore, then melting it entirely, then mixing it with tin to create bronze. Bronze was not just another tool, it was a revolution. With fire and metal together, we could cut more cleanly, hunt more effectively, and build more ambitiously, and it all began in the furnace, where the roar of flames replaced the crackle of the cooking fire, shaping ourselves. Fire also began to shape our bodies, not in the slow drift of evolution, but in the way it altered what we ate, wore, and built. Cooking broke down fibers in food, making it easier to digest and freeing energy for other uses. Warmth from the hearth meant we no longer needed the same thick coats of fur our ancestors might have relied on. Clothing became lighter, more varied, more decorative. We could preserve food by smoking it, carry it further without it rotting, feed larger groups for longer, our stomachs, our teeth. Even our jaws began to reflect this new diet. And with better tools came better shelters. Fire-hardened wood supported heavier roofs. Metal blades cut timbers more precisely. A permanent hearth meant a permanent home. And from there, villages grew into towns, towns into cities, making fire move. The biggest leap came when we learned to make fire move. Harnessing the wind to feed it in kilns and furnaces gave us higher temperatures. Pairing it with water power let us drive early machines. And one day, someone set a sealed pot of water over a strong flame and watched it tremble, then rattle, then spit out a force that could push a lid away. Steam. At first, it was a curiosity, a party trick for the curious. But the lesson sank in fire could turn water into air that moved, air that could push, air that could work. The industrial age didn't begin in a single moment, but every blast furnace, every steam engine, every roaring factory was a direct descendant of that first pot. Fire now turned wheels, powered ships, pulled trains across continents. It stopped being a circle in the center of our lives and became the driving line through them. Power without rest. There was a cost to this. The old hearth had natural limits, fuel ran out. Nights ended, storms put flames to sleep, but the engines of the new world didn't sleep. They ate coal and belched smoke day and night. With this came wealth and growth cities lit by gas lamps. Goods made faster than ever, but also danger. Fire in an engine didn't have the gentleness of the hearth. It could explode without warning, burning everything it touched. Factories collapsed under the weight of their own heat. Mines feeding the flames claimed lives as easily as they gave up coal. Yet we kept feeding it, because it kept giving back. Faster ships meant wider trade. Steam trains stitched continents together. Machines powered by fire worked through the night, no longer bound by sunrise and sunset. We had entered a partnership with fire that neither side seemed willing to end. Fire as master. But if fire had once been a servant, now it was edging toward mastery. We burned forests not to survive a night, but to clear space for crops meant to feed millions. We dug deeper into the earth to find coal and oil, fuel that burned hotter and longer than wood. We lit cities bright enough to turn night into day, and in doing so, we began to forget the dark entirely. The old rituals faded. No one kept an eternal flame in their home. Few sat in silence to watch the way coals glowed and shifted. Fire was no longer sacred, it was infrastructure. And yet, when we saw a building burning, we still froze. When a forest fire roared toward a town, we still feared it the way our ancestors had. The respect was still there, buried under our belief that we had control. The final transformation, the last and perhaps most dangerous transformation, came when we taught fire to live inside weapons. Black powder, born from carefully mixed charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter, turned fire into a projectile. Guns, cannons, explosives. They were all just new ways of throwing flame further, faster, with more certainty. Now, fire didn't just shape landscapes or heat metal. It could end lives from a mile away. And later, in the 20th century, we split the atom and found a fire that dwarfed every hearth, every torch, every furnace before it. This was a flame that could erase cities in a single light. We had taken the ember from the old campfire and fed it until it became a sun. We began by stealing fire from lightning. We ended by building it ourselves in forms that lightning could never match. It had been warmth, weapon, altar, engine. It had been a companion, a servant, a god, and a threat. And through it all, we had carried the same ember, sometimes in a clay pot, sometimes in our hands, sometimes hidden in machines so vast they filled the horizon. We began this story in the dark, a darkness so complete that you could not see your own hand unless it moved in front of your eyes. A darkness broken only by starlight or the sudden, terrifying bloom of lightning in the sky. Somewhere in that dark, our ancestors saw fire for the first time, and instead of running, they reached for it. From that moment, everything changed. The arc of the flame. At first, it was survival. We guarded fire like a secret, because it was one. We moved it from camp to camp, ember to ember, sleeping with it beside us like a child that might wake in the night and vanish if not watched. Then came skill, the rare few who could make fire appear where there had been none. Then came ambition, as flames became weapons, boundaries, and symbols of power. Then reverence, as we built myths and rituals to honour something we half feared and half worshipped. We bent fire to our will in furnaces and kilns, shaping metal, clay, and ourselves. We made it turn wheels, move ships, pull trains, power cities, and at last, we taught it to destroy on a scale so vast that even the sun seemed a little less untouchable. Every step took us further from that first, trembling reach into the unknown, and yet, in another way, we've been carrying the same flame the whole time, mastery or partnership. We like to tell ourselves that we mastered fire, that we tamed it, like a horse, or fenced it in, like a field, but the truth feels less certain. Every time we thought we had fire under control, it found a way to surprise us. A spark that became a forest fire, a furnace that exploded, a bomb that ended a war and began a new kind of fear. Maybe we didn't so much master fire as make a deal with it. We give it fuel, and it gives us heat, light, movement, destruction, whatever we ask. But in every deal, there's risk. Fire doesn't care what it burns. It will just as easily warm a child's bed as erase a city. It doesn't know the difference between cooking a meal and starting a war. The choice and the danger have always been ours, the last hearth. In some places, people still keep a hearth burning, not because they need it for survival, but because they want to remember the smell of wood smoke, the sound of crackling logs, the slow dance of embers. These are older than any city, any flag, any god we've ever known. If you've ever sat in front of a campfire and felt that strange calm, you've touched the same experience as a hunter 400,000 years ago, a herder 10,000 years ago, a child in a cave listening to the stories of elders. The circle of light is the same, the darkness beyond it is the same, and maybe that's why, even now, fire still feels like a living thing because we've been looking at it for so long that it has shaped the way we see everything else. The question we can't answer. The story of fire is, in a way, the story of us. How we saw something wild and decided to carry it with us. How we learned to shape it into something that could cook our food, guard our homes, and move our machines. How we took it so far from its beginnings that it can now burn without wood, without air, without end. And yet, the question remains, did we shape fire, or did fire shape us? Without it, maybe we would have stayed in the dark, our lives shorter, our reach smaller. Without it, maybe we would never have smelted metal, built cities, or crossed oceans. Without it, maybe we would never have imagined we could change the world at all. But with it, we've done more than change the world. We've risked it. Returning to the dark one day, the last flame you see might not be a hearth or a candle. It might be the burning edge of a sky you once thought was safe. Or maybe, if we're wise or lucky, it will be a small fire shared between people, passing a story back and forth the way we once passed embers. Because in the end, every great fire is just a lot of small fires together, and every small fire can be carried, guarded, handed on. That's what our ancestors did for us. They kept the flame alive through winters that killed without mercy, through nights filled with predators, through migrations and wars and losses we can't imagine. They gave us a light to see by, a heat to live by. What we do with it now is our part of the bargain. You can turn off the lights in your room right now and still not know what real dark is. You can click a switch and summon a light that needs no tending, no fuel, no care. That's our triumph. But it's also what makes it so easy to forget how fragile the first fire was. So maybe, tonight, when you close your eyes, you'll picture that small circle of light. See the figures gathered close, hear the low hum of voices, feel the heat on your face and the cold at your back. Somewhere in that circle is a figure whose only job is to keep the coals alive until morning. And because they did, you're here. Some fires go out because there's nothing left to burn. Others go out because there's no one left to tend them. When we tell the story of fire, we often talk about the ones that lasted the eternal flames. The hearths passed from hand to hand across centuries. But there are more fires we've lost than we can count, and not all of them burned wood. The fires of cities. Take the great library of Alexandria. It wasn't a place for warmth, not in the physical sense. But it was a fire, a gathering of human thought so bright that it lit the minds of thousands who never set foot in it. Scrolls from Egypt, Greece, India, China all stored in one place. And then, one day, that fire went out. Not in a roar, not in a single night, but in waves of neglect, accident, and destruction, until there was only ash. The Maya had their own fire, the new fire ceremony. Every 52 years, they let every flame in the empire die. Darkness covered the land. Then, in a single, sacred act, they lit a new fire on the chest of a sacrificed man, and from that, the whole world was rekindled. It was a reminder that even the sun could die, and only ritual and responsibility could bring it back. That fire burned for centuries in the hearts of their people, until the empire fell, and the ceremony faded into memory. The Polynesians carried fire across oceans, not just in clay pots, but in the form of knowledge how to read the stars, the currents, the moods of the sea. That fire didn't just light their huts, it lit entire archipelagos. Now, most of that knowledge is gone, replaced by maps and engines. The ember is still there, small and hidden, in the hands of a few navigators who remember how to see the ocean the old way. The fires of families, not all forgotten fires, belong to empires. Some lived in small houses, in the way a grandmother stirred a pot or told a story. Every family has its own embers recipes, songs, jokes. The way someone ties a knot or sharpens a blade, they don't seem like much until they're gone. One generation forgets to ask, the next doesn't know to miss it, and the ember turns cold without anyone noticing. Sometimes, the last person who knows a story dies, and the fire goes out with them. The room looks the same, the chairs are still there, but there's a silence where the crackle used to be. The fires of ideas. Ideas burn too. Some flare bright for a moment, movements, inventions, revolutions, and then vanish. Others smoulder quietly for centuries, waiting for the right air to breathe again. Think of the ancient Greek steam engine, a curiosity, never used for industry, left to fade in the dark for nearly 2,000 years before someone lit that ember again. Or the medical knowledge of old civilizations, lost in war and conquest, only to be rediscovered in dusty archives centuries later. What else have we lost? What fires burned once in the minds of people we'll never meet, doing things we can't imagine, in places we'll never see. Why they go out, fires don't go out just because of neglect. Sometimes they're extinguished on purpose. Invaders stamp out a culture's language. Leaders ban a belief. New tools make old skills irrelevant. The flame isn't given a chance to die, it's smothered. And sometimes, the fire isn't taken from us. We give it away. We decide it's too much work to keep tending, or we tell ourselves it doesn't matter anymore. We trade it for something faster, brighter, easier. And by the time we realize what we've lost, the ember is dust. The coast of cold ash. I once stood on a beach at night where hundreds of small fires had burned for centuries. Fishermen would light them at dusk to guide boats back to shore. Now, the sand was empty. The boats had engines, the fishermen had lamps, and the old fire pits were just circles of cold stone. I tried to imagine what it must have looked like, a necklace of flames along the dark coast, each one telling a boat, "You're almost home." Now, there was only the sea and the sound of the wind, and a darkness that felt heavier than it should have. The fires were gone, but the absence of them was still there, like an echo you can't stop hearing. The common thread. The fires we forget have one thing in common: someone stopped tending them. It's easy to think of fire as fragile, needing fuel, air, shelter from rain. But in truth, the most important thing it needs is a keeper. Someone to get up in the middle of the night, feed it one more stick, Watch the embers until they glow again. Without that, no matter how bright it burns, it will fade. We inherit more fires than we realize. Some we see clearly traditions, skills, beliefs. Others are hidden ways of thinking, ways of seeing the world. We don't own them. We just carry them for a while, and if we're lucky, we pass them on still burning. But if we forget the world grows colder, and we don't even know why, if an ember is never truly ours, only borrowed, then every moment we hold it is part of a chain that began long before us. And if we drop it, the chain breaks not just for us, but for everyone who might have come after. The keeper's burden somewhere, right now. Someone is the last keeper of a fire. It might be the only person alive who can speak a nearly extinct language. It might be a farmer planting a seed his grandparents brought from another continent. It might be an old musician who still remembers the way a song was played before it was written down. They don't own these things. They're carrying them like a coal cupped in both hands, shopping to pass it to someone else before the wind takes it. That's the strange part of keeping an ember. You do it for people you will never meet. The first time you see it. Think back to the first time you saw fire as a child. Not the electric light in a room, but real fire. Maybe a candle, maybe a campfire. It didn't just light the space it moved. It had shape, but no body. It reached for you without touching. For our ancestors, that moment happened not once, but for the first time in human history. Someone saw fire, understood it could be carried, and passed that knowledge on. That ember became your ember, across hundreds of thousands of years. You're here because someone, long ago, decided not to let the dark win. Passing it on, passing an ember forward doesn't always look like handing someone a flame. Sometimes it's teaching them a skill. Sometimes it's telling a story so well that they can't forget it. Sometimes it's just living in a way that makes them want to keep the same fire alive. It's not always dramatic. You may never know the moment you pass it on. But one day, they'll find themselves repeating your words, or standing where you once stood, or using the thing you showed them how to make. And in that moment, your ember moves on without you. The embers we can't see. There are embers we carry without realizing. Ways of solving problems, ways of treating strangers, ways of seeing beauty. These came from someone, maybe a parent, maybe a teacher, maybe someone whose name you never learned. And there will be people who carry your embers without knowing it. Something you did will outlast you, the way the smoke of an old fire still lingers in the walls of a house. The future's fire. We like to think the fires of the future will look like our warmth, light, comfort, but they might not. They might be digital, invisible, spread in signals and codes instead of sparks and smoke. They might not need fuel, or they might need something we don't even have words for yet. The question is the same. Will they have keepers? Will someone guard them through the night? Because if we've learned anything from the forgotten fires, it's that the world doesn't lose light all at once. It goes dark one ember at a time. A story to end the night. Imagine you're holding a coal. It is small enough to fit in your palm, but hot enough to burn you if you're careless. You can feel its weight not in grams, but in the years it has travelled to reach you. Behind you, there is a line of people stretching back into the dark, each one carrying the same coal in their turn. Ahead of you is another line, disappearing into a horizon you will never see. All you have to do is keep it alive long enough to hand it to the next person. That's all anyone has ever done, and yet, that small act is everything. We talk about progress as if it's a race, or a ladder, or a conquest. But maybe it's simpler. Maybe it's just keeping a little fire alive until the next hand is ready to take it. Because one day, you won't be here. The ember will, and the question won't be whether it was yours, it never was, but whether you kept it burning while it was in your care. We've spent this whole night talking about fire as if it always meant flame light. Heat, smoke curling into the dark. But some embers don't burn, some don't glow, and yet they can warm a life or leave it cold forever. The first ember story. Long before anyone learned to keep a real fire alive, we learned to keep a story alive, around a flickering hearth. Yes, but the flame wasn't in the wood, it was in the words. Imagine a circle of faces, lit only by a few coals. Someone speaks. The words move from their mouth into your mind, and suddenly you're seeing what they saw. A hunt, a storm, a death, a dream. The storyteller is holding an ember they got from someone else and passing it into you. You carry it away without thinking, and maybe, years later, you tell it again. The ember flares for someone new, but like any fire, a story dies when no one tends it. The last person who remembers forgets a detail, then a name, then the ending, and the ember turns cold. The second ember. Skill. Not every ember is poetic. Some are practical. Think about the first person who learned to knap a stone into a blade. It wasn't obvious. You had to strike at the right angle, with the right force, over and over, until the stone split the way you wanted. That knowledge where to hit, how to hold, when to stop, wasn't written anywhere. It was passed from hand to hand. In the same way you might light one stick from another. Skills like that are fires we've been keeping for hundreds of thousands of years, weaving fibres into rope, shaping clay into vessels, reading animal tracks in the mud. Each one an ember that could be lost in a single generation if no one carries it forward. The third ember language is a fire so vast we forget it had to be lit. Every word you know was once invented by someone whispered for the first time into an open sky. When a language dies, it's not just words we lose. We lose the jokes, the songs, the ways of thinking that only that language could hold. An extinct language is an ember drowned in water. No amount of striking will bring it back. The fourth ember, trust. There's one ember that doesn't look like fire at all, trust. It burns between people. It lets us share food without fear, sleep without watching the door, believe someone when they point and say danger or safe. Without it, fire itself is useless. What good is a flame if you can't trust someone else to guard it while you sleep? Trust can last for generations or vanish overnight. Once gone, it's hard to relight. Why these embers matter? We've always thought of civilization as a collection of buildings, tools, and laws. But those are just the hearths. The real heat comes from the invisible embers inside stories. Skills, languages, trust. Lose them, and the structures stand cold. Keep them, and even the simplest shelter feels warm. The weight of invisible fire. You might be holding one of these embers right now without realizing it. A recipe you learned from someone who's gone. A word you use that your grandparents used too. A skill you could teach in the dark with no tools but your hands. They don't take up space. They don't weigh anything you can measure. But they can survive winters, wars, and silence if you choose to keep them. We've been talking about fire as if it's fragile. But the truth is, the most fragile embers are the ones we can see. The ones no one notices until they're gone. The ones you're carrying right now. If there are embers we can't see, then there must be fires we haven't found. Maybe they're burning right now, somewhere far from here, in a place so quiet you wouldn't know anything lived there. Or maybe they're buried deep, sleeping under ash, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig. The thing about fire is that it doesn't care where it burns. It only cares if someone is willing to keep it, walking away from the old hearth. You've been sitting by this fire a long time now. You know the sound it makes when it's healthy, the way it flares when you feed it, the slow sigh when it starts to fade. You've watched sparks leap and die. You've held the ember in your hands and passed it on. But tonight, something changes. The air shifts. The light feels complete. It's time to move on. Not because this fire has nothing left, but because there are others out there and they need tending too. So you stand, letting the warmth fall away from your skin. The darkness presses in around you, but you're not afraid. You've been in the dark before. You take one coal from the fire and hold it in a pouch, close to your chest, not as a souvenir, but as a promise. The path between fires. Travelling between fires is harder than staying at one. The cold bites harder when you're alone. The nights stretch longer, and every shadow looks like it's moving. But you learn to listen differently out here. Not for the crackle of your own fire, but for the distant signals of another. A flicker between trees. The faint smell of smoke carried by the wind. Sometimes you walk for days and find nothing. Sometimes you crest a hill and see a glow in the valley below, faint but steady. And sometimes you come to a place where the fire is all but gone, and the people around it have forgotten why they lit it in the first place. The fires of other nights once, you arrive at a shore. The air is thick with salt. The sky is heavy with stars you don't recognize. In the distance, you see a ring of stones and ancient hearth, still warm, though no one has sat here in years. You kneel. There's no flame, just a few blackened logs and a smell of something once sweet. You blow gently. The ash stirs, and then, almost shyly, a single thread of orange glows back at you. You feed it, slowly, carefully, until it's strong enough to stand on its own. You wonder who left it here. Did they mean for you to find it, or has it been waiting, through rain and storm, for any stranger to care? Some fires burn without flames. Not all the fires you find will be the kind you expect. There's a village where the fire is music drums that call the people together, songs that carry through the hills like smoke. They have no hearth, but they have heat all the same. There's a monastery where the fire is word script written by hand, passed from one scribe to the next over centuries. The lamps flicker low, but the fire in the pages will outlast the oil. There's a city where the fire is memory monuments to those who came before, standing tall against the wind. The people pass them without looking, but the stone still burns for anyone who stops to feel it. Why we keep walking? You could stop at any of these fires. Stay, warm yourself, let someone else carry the ember forward. But the truth is, no one else is coming. At least, not in time. The ember in your pouch is still alive. It hums faintly against your chest, reminding you that your work isn't finished. If you rest too long, it will fade. So you keep moving, not because you're chasing something, but because you're carrying it. The last fire you'll ever see one day. There will be a night when you set down your pouch and know you won't pick it up again. You'll kneel beside a fire you've built for the last time. You'll feed it until it's strong, and then you'll call someone over. You'll show them how to cup the ember in their hands. You'll warn them about the wind. You'll tell them to keep it close, and then you'll step back, letting the warmth slip away for good. You won't watch them walk into the dark. You don't need to. You've done your part. Somewhere out there, another fire will burn because of you. What comes next? We've spent this night with the first firewood, spark, ember. But there are other nights ahead. Nights when the fire is made of iron, forged in the hearts of cities that never sleep. Nights when the fire is the glow of oil lamps, flickering over maps that chart the rise and fall of empires. Nights when the fire is not light at all, but the quiet knowledge in someone's eyes, passed on in a glance. And there will be nights when the fire dies, and you have to decide whether to light it again. You adjust the pouch on your chest and take the first step toward the next horizon. Behind you, the old hearth fades into the dark. Ahead, the night waits. Somewhere in that darkness is another fire, and maybe, just maybe, it's been waiting for you. And so we come back to the ember, not the roaring bonfire that draws crowds, not the flash that blinds for a second, but the quiet, steady coal that has passed from hand to hand for longer than history remembers. We've walked with it through the first wild flames that lit the faces of creatures not yet called human. We've carried it across ice and ocean, through famine and war. We've built cities around it. We've written laws by its light. We've destroyed each other with it. We've saved each other with it. Fire has never been just a tool. It's been a mirror. It shows us whether we use our light to warm or to burn, to feed or to take. And the ember doesn't care which we choose, only that we choose, and that we pass it on before our hands grow cold. Tonight, somewhere, someone is lighting a match. It might be you. It might be someone you'll never meet. But if you trace that flame back through your parents, your ancestors, the ones before them, and before them still you'll find it leading into the dark, to a place where one of our kind leaned close, cupped their hands, and breathed life into a spark. When you light a match tonight, whose hands lit it first, if you've been here for this journey, if the ember has stayed warm in your hands through the telling, I'd love it if you liked this video, shared it with another Sapiens, and maybe even subscribed so we can keep walking together into the next night. Not for the algorithm, not for numbers, but because some fires are easier to keep when more people are watching them. Sleep well, knowing there's a little light still burning somewhere. We'll meet again by another fire. Until then, keep the ember close. You carry that ember in your imagination, glowing faintly at the edge of sleep, but before it fades, let's widen the circle. Let's trace where those first sparks were struck, where the ash settled, and how archaeologists can still read it today like handwriting on stone. The earliest evidence of fire use in human history isn't a single campfire you can point to. It's layers of blackened earth, pockets of ash, and bones that tell us something unnatural touched them. In South Africa's Wonderwork Cave, deep in a chamber 30 meters from the entrance, researchers found burned plant remains and bones dating back more than 1 million years. This wasn't wildfire lightning doesn't strike inside caves. It meant that early humans, likely Homo erectus, were bringing fire in, keeping it alive and letting its light stretch into the dark. Elsewhere, at Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, archaeologists uncovered stone tools lying side by side with charred seeds and wood fragments, nearly 780,000 years old. The seeds tell a subtle story. They were roasted, blackened but not destroyed, suggesting people were controlling the heat, not just tossing food into flames. It's here we begin to see not just survival fire, but cooking fire, the difference between a scavenger's meal and a deliberate recipe. Cooking changed everything. The theory popularized by Richard Wrangham, the cooking hypothesis, argues that fire in human evolution was the turning point that transformed not just diet, but anatomy. Raw roots and meat demand huge jaws and long guts to process. Cooked food is softer, more calorie-dense, easier to chew and digest. When humans learned to cook with fire, our teeth and jaws shrank, our intestines shortened, and the spare energy went somewhere else to the brain. Fire may have lit the way for art and language not only by brightening the night, but by feeding the cortex itself. Imagine chewing raw tubers until your jaw aches, or gnawing sinew from an uncooked bone until your teeth splinter. Now compare that to dropping it over coals, smelling fat crackle and starch sweeten. Fire didn't just make food safer, it made it worth eating. The sweetness of a roasted chestnut, the tenderness of boiled marrow, the transformation of bitter roots into something edible, each was an evolutionary step. And in every flame, there's still the whisper of that first surprise that heat could change the very substance of the world. But fire in human evolution wasn't just about food. It was survival against cold, especially as our ancestors moved out of Africa into the chill of Europe and Asia. When the Ice Age pressed down with endless winters, when snow fell in forests heavy with silence, the difference between a family huddled around a fire and one shivering without it was the difference between memory and oblivion. Archaeological layers from Zhoukoudian in China, dating back nearly 500,000 years, show burned bones and ash inside caves where Homo erectus once sheltered. The fire inside those caves wasn't decorative, it was life support. Without fire, the human migration northward would have frozen in its tracks. Even the act of keeping fire became an ancestral ritual. You didn't casually let flames die out. An ember banked in ash could smoulder for days, wrapped in bark, carried across valleys. Fire-making was rare and difficult. Fire-keeping was the art. Whole communities built their days around tending the flame. A careless child or a distracted hunter who let it go out risked not just a scolding, but the survival of the clan. Think of how your stomach twists when the power goes out today, the sudden helplessness, the rush to preserve what you can. For them, it wasn't just inconvenience, it was extinction creeping closer with every cold breath. And yet, the fire gave more than warmth and calories, it gave time. Before fire, night was a wall. Predators ruled, darkness pressed close, and humans slept uneasily. Bodies curled against cold soil. With fire, the circle widened. Flames pushed back the dark, and suddenly there were hours after sunset where stories could be told, tools could be shaped, songs could be sung. Around that fire, culture was born. It's no coincidence that myths across the world tie fire to divine theft or sacred duty. In Greek mythology, Prometheus steals it from the gods. In Hindu tradition, Agni is the immortal fire deity, present in every sacrifice. In Rome, the Vestal Virgins tended the eternal flame of the city. Beneath the poetry lies a shared truth fire was never fully ours. It had to be borrowed, begged, stolen, or honoured. Even today, that truth lingers. A gas stove igniting in a blue flick is still a controlled explosion of chemistry. A candle flame is still a piece of plasma born from combustion. When you light a match, you're replaying a ritual older than language is striking cellulose and sulfur into a controlled burn. The story of fire in human history isn't a straight line of progress. It's a fragile thread of continuity, stretching back to embers carried across plains, forward to the screens that glow in your hands tonight, and the fragility never vanished. Imagine being one of those early groups on the move. You're carrying not just food or tools, but the ember itself, wrapped against the wind, cradled like a heartbeat. One stumble, one rainstorm, one careless moment, and it's gone. No matches, no lighter, just cold stone, wet wood, and the memory of something you can't recreate. How did humans control fire is a question archaeologists ask. But for the people who lived it, the harder question was always, how do we keep it alive? So when we talk about the history of fire, we're not just listing sites and dates, we're looking at the silent thread that binds every human who's ever lived. The fire in Wonderwork Cave, the ash at Jokudian, the roasted seeds at Gesher Benot Yaakov, each was part of the same flame that still flickers in your stove, your candle, your screen. It's a story of fragility disguised as power, a reminder that humanity's greatest tool was also humanity's first leash. When humans learned not only to keep fire, but to master it, something shifted. The ember in a cave became the torch at the city gate. The warmth of survival became the hearth of civilization. In ancient Mesopotamia, fire was as much an administrative tool as a spiritual one. Clay tablets were baked hard in kilns, preserving contracts and myths in cuneiform. Smelters fanned flames to extract copper and bronze from stone, turning fire into the heart of the first industries. When people ask, when did humans control fire, the archaeological record gives a range, but the real answer is that every new control unlocked a new stage of history. Fire wasn't just warmth in the dark, it was currency, infrastructure, power. The Greeks honoured fire in every household hearth, linking it to Hestia, goddess of the home. Without her flame, no meal, no family, no order felt complete. Rome elevated that idea further with the Vestal Virgins, priestesses sworn to guard the city's eternal flame. If the sacred fire ever went out, Romans believed disaster would follow. Fire in ancient civilizations wasn't metaphorical, it was literally the measure of continuity, the heartbeat of a community given form. In India's Vedic tradition, Agni, the fire god, was not just a deity, but the messenger between humans and the divine. Every sacrifice, every prayer was carried upward in smoke. To lose fire was to lose connection with the gods. The same idea appears in countless traditions in Zoroastrian temples, where flames burned eternally, in Japanese rituals where fire purified and protected. Across the world, fire became the language of the sacred. But fire also terrified. It destroyed as often as it nurtured. Cities made of wood and thatch knew that one stray spark could erase generations. London's Great Fire in 666 is only the most famous example. Earlier towns burned just as easily. Ancient laws often carried harsh punishments for arson, because fire wasn't just crime, it was apocalypse. Still, what frightened most wasn't the runaway blaze, but the silence of no flame at all. Survival without fire was nearly impossible for pre-modern people. Hunters in the Arctic relied on seal oil lamps to keep the dark at bay. Farmers in temperate zones timed planting and harvest with the ashes of seasonal burns. Communities carried embers inside clay pots or bundles of bark, never letting them die. The phrase ancient fire-making techniques is misleading. Striking sparks from flint or rubbing sticks together was a desperate backup, not a daily habit. The true art was never letting the fire go out. Think about the patience that required. A smouldering log, buried in ash, had to be checked constantly. If smoke grew thin, someone fanned it. If a journey lasted days, someone carried it close to the body, sheltered from rain. You didn't leave home without food, water, and fire. It was the third essential. Without it, even the strongest hunter returned as nothing more than another vulnerable animal. That vulnerability explains why fire became such a powerful symbol of resilience. Myths of fire, Theft Prometheus in Greece, Maui in Polynesia, Raven in the Pacific Northwest. All stories of people or tricksters outwitting nature to steal its brightest weapon. They reflect the same truth that fire was never easy, never ours, and always one mistake away from being lost. Even in war, fire was double-edged. It cooked food for soldiers and forged their weapons, but it also destroyed cities, salted fields, erased enemies. To command fire was to command fear. Ancient generals knew that burning a town was more psychological than strategic, a reminder that everything humans build still bows to flame. Fast forward to today, and we forget this. A switch clicks, a burner glows, a heater hums, but beneath it lies the same fragility. Our fire is electrical current running in wires, but when the grid fails, when storms or disasters hit, we return to the same panic as our ancestors: how to cook, how to stay warm, how to keep the dark from pressing in. Search engines overflow with questions like how to make fire without matches or primitive fire survival techniques. The anxiety is ancient. The ember in our imagination never fully dims. So, what is the legacy of fire? It is carved into our bones. Smaller jaws, bigger brains, shorter guts, all consequences of that first roasted root. It is etched in our myths, from sacred flames to hellfire. It glows in our cities, from neon lights to nuclear reactors. Fire is the most human of forces, yet never truly human. We borrowed it from lightning and volcanoes, and we still borrow it now, caging it in furnaces, engines, and wires. The ember you picture at the end of this story is both fragile and eternal. It is the same ember that burned in Wonderwork Cave 1,000,000 years ago, that smoked in Jokudian 500,000 years ago, that roasted seeds at Gesher Benot Yaakov. It is the same ember that lit temples, forges, and hearths. It is the ember that burned London to the ground and lit rockets to the moon. And when you strike a match tonight, or watch the glow of a screen before sleep, remember you're not inventing anything new. You're repeating a gesture that has bound every ancestor, every stranger, every human who ever lived. The history of fire is the history of us, and we are still just its keepers.